One day you hit everything, and the next day you can't even hit a single shot. Your aim feels worse, your decision making feels worse, and even your movement feels worse. Most players call this inconsistency. However, I don't think that's the actual problem here. There's one thing I've noticed that is honestly kind of weird. Whenever I go to the gym in the morning, I always play incredibly bad afterwards. My reactions feel slower, my aim feels less precise, and I hesitate more often. And I lose fights that I normally wouldn't lose. However, on days where I usually don't go to the gym in the morning, I suddenly play much closer to what I usually call normal. For a long time, I thought that this simply meant that I was inconsistent. Some days are good, some days are bad, and some days are somewhere in between. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation actually made sense. Because if my skill was actually changing this rapidly from day to day, then something would be seriously wrong. After all, I didn't suddenly forget how to position myself. I suddenly didn't lose hundreds of hours of experience. And I definitely didn't wake up with a completely different understanding of the game. So, why was I playing worse? The strange part wasn't that I played worse after going to the gym. The strange part was that I was still expecting to perform the same as I usually do. And the first mistake a lot of players make is surprisingly simple. They compare themselves to their best performance instead of their average performance. Let's say you have one incredible evening. Everything goes right. You hit every important shot, you win almost every engagement, you make every correct decision. And by the end of the session, you feel unstoppable. The problem is that this is the performance you remember, not the 20 average sessions that happened before that. Humans are incredibly good at remembering emotional experiences. We remember the clutch, we remember the headshot, we remember the 10 kill game. However, what we usually don't remember are the dozens of games where we perform to our normal skill level. And this creates a very strange problem. Whenever we perform normal, it feels like we're underperforming. Not because we're actually playing badly, but because we're comparing ourselves unconsciously to the perfect sessions we had. And once that comparison becomes a standard, of course consistency becomes impossible. Because no player can consistently perform at their peak. Not you, not me, and not even the best players in the world. But if that's true, why does inconsistency bother me so much? The answer is actually pretty simple. Players can handle losing, they can handle winning. However, what players really struggle with is uncertainty. If you lose every single game tonight, at least you understand what's happening. Right? Maybe you're tired, maybe you're tilted, or maybe you're just having a bad day. The reason inconsistency feels so frustrating is because it removes your ability to explain your own performance. Yesterday, you dominated every fight. And today, you lose to players who you usually wipe the floor with. And suddenly, your brain starts looking for an explanation. Maybe your aim is bad. Maybe your settings are wrong. Maybe you're just tired. Or maybe you simply stopped improving. However, most players don't arrive at this conclusion because they realize that their gameplay is inconsistent. They arrive there because inconsistency is the easiest explanation for that problem. It gives a name to a problem they don't fully understand. However, the difference between naming something and actually understanding something is completely different. You see, there's another problem when you're using your best games as a benchmark. Your best games are usually terrible evidence. Most players assume that their best performing matches are a true representation of their highest skill ceiling. In reality, those matches are actually a combination of skill, confidence, momentum, and favorable circumstances. Maybe the enemy team made mistakes. Maybe you constantly had the better position. Maybe you won an important fight in the early game and carried that confidence through the whole session. And maybe every decision felt obvious because everything was working. The point is not that your performance was fake. The point, however, is that it wasn't normal. And that's exactly why you remember it. A player's peak performance is not their baseline performance. Yet, many players chase a version of themselves that only existed for a few hours. And now every normal session feels disappointing. Every normal mistake feels unacceptable. And every loss feels like evidence that something is wrong. But in reality, nothing is wrong. You're simply comparing your average to your unrealistic standard. And no player on this earth can consistently keep up with the highlight reel. And this is actually where things become really interesting. Because most players assume that every match is a fair measurement of their skill. But that assumption falls apart immediately. Think about how many variables influence your performance on a daily basis. How much did you sleep? How stressful was your day? How mentally exhausted are you? When was the last time you ate? How focused are you right now? We accept these factors everywhere. A student performs worse after sleepless nights. An athlete performs worse when he's exhausted. And an employee performs worse after an incredibly stressful week. Nobody finds that surprising. Yet gamers somehow expect an identical performance every evening. And let's be honest here, that explanation makes no sense. If you slept 5 hours, worked overtime, skipped lunch and spent the whole day on complex problems. Why would you expect the same performance that you had on a relaxing Sunday evening? You're still the same player and you still have the same knowledge, yes. However, the conditions are simply not the same. And if your conditions aren't the same, why are you expecting the same outcomes? And one thing that is even more interesting, players rarely blame these factors. Nobody finishes a session and says to themselves, "Oh yeah, I was mentally exhausted today." Nobody says, "I was operating on 6 hours of sleep." Instead, they just say, "My aim today was terrible," or "My mechanics were off," or "My movement sucked." The skill becomes the explanation, even when it was actually never the cause. And that's why so many players misdiagnose their own performance. They focus on the symptoms, but completely ignore the conditions that created it. But if performance naturally fluctuates, why do pros seem so consistent? The answer is surprisingly simple. They don't. At least not in the way most players think. Professional players also have bad games. They miss shots. They make mistakes. And they also lose fights that they should have won. The difference is that most players don't see that moment. What you see online is usually a highlight reel. You see the best games, the best clips, and the most entertaining moments. But you rarely see the 6 normal matches that happened before that. Or the frustrating session that happened yesterday. Which is actually something that I find kinda interesting about Drachta, because he actually posts some of his matches that are just incredibly frustrating. Which just shows that bad games happen to everyone. The problem is that most players compare their entire gaming experience to somebody else's highlight reel. But that's not really a fair comparison. But there's another reason why good players appear more consistent. Their fundamentals are stronger. Their positioning is better, their rotations are better, their information gathering is better, and their decision making is better. And when one skill underperforms, the rest of their fundamentals carry them through the game. Their entire performance isn't focused on just one skill. And that's where actually a lot of players run into trouble. Because most players build their entire identity around one skill. Maybe it's aim, maybe it's movement, maybe aggression, and maybe just mechanical talent. As long as that works, everything is fine. But the moment that one skill underperforms, everything falls apart. A player whose entire game plan is to rely on his aim feels helpless when the aim is not there anymore. A player whose entire game relies on aggression struggles when confidence disappears. A player whose game completely relies on mechanics suddenly lose when the mechanics aren't actually there anymore. The problem isn't the bad day. The problem is the missing foundation underneath it. Because truly consistent players don't build their game around one skill. They build their game around what remains when they're not at their best. If your aim is struggling, can you still position well? Can you still gather information properly? Can you still rotate intelligently? Can you still create favorable fights? Can you still avoid unnecessary risk? Those are the questions that matter. Because consistency isn't created by making one skill stronger. It's created by making your weakness less damaging. The most consistent players aren't the ones that have always incredible aim. They are the ones whose game don't collapse when it doesn't. And by the way, if you enjoy short high-density analysis like this one, focus on where players misunderstand improvement and where common assumptions break down. That's exactly what this channel does. Subscribing makes sense.